All right, full disclosure on the biofuels side of things. My PhD work was looking at ethanol. I did air pollution modeling, and I looked at what would happen if we switched our vehicles over to using E85, which is 85% ethanol, and how that would impact air pollution on the back end. So that was my PhD work. So I have a little bit of background in thinking about fuel policies and biofuels. And then for my postdoc, I looked more at sustainable transportation options broadly. So we've talked a little bit about biomass already, but not particularly about the biofuels themselves. So we've talked about this food versus fuel kind of tension around biofuels. It's one of the challenges when we're thinking about biofuels. In particular, in the US, we really use corn for our ethanol, and we'll talk more about those impacts. So you'll remember from me being a giant foot that we're talking a lot about the carbon footprint of our biofuels. So the idea of the biofuel to be carbon neutral is just kind of what this diagram is showing you, that you burn the fuel, it releases CO2, that CO2 would be reabsorbed by the crops, and then you're fermenting the crops, the sugars from the crops back into the fuel, and this would be carbon neutral. What it's missing is all of the energy inputs and other things that come into this to play. And I would say one of the big ones that often is thought of as an indirect impact is the land use side of things, and how that's impacting the CO2 and the carbon footprint of our biofuels. The biofuels that we use today are mainly ethanol and biodiesel. So ethanol as a gasoline, I can't say really replacement, but as a gasoline additive, and then biodiesel as a diesel additive. Those are the two biggest ones today. Renewable diesel, though, the third one up there, is very much a growing sector. And we'll talk about the difference between biodiesel and renewable diesel in a minute. But those are the big ones. And then sustainable aviation fuels also are kind of coming into play, but what those will be is still, I would say, that's very much in development. There's a lot of interest in that area. Okay, so when I'm saying it's mostly ethanol and biodiesel, this is just showing you biofuels globally. It's mostly that ethanol, the yellow piece, and then biodiesel is the orange, and then you can see renewable diesel, the green one, is growing. It's only about 3.5% of our transportation energy, so it's a pretty small portion. Remember we saw it's all oil. This is a very small portion that we're talking about. But it's 90% of what we would consider renewable energy in our transportation system if these are done renewably, right? So we're not very far along in terms of electrification of our transportation systems. And most of the biofuels are produced and used in the US, Brazil, and Europe. Those are the three biggest markets for biofuels for our transportation system. So looking at the US, here's ethanol as our biggest biofuel, and then biodiesel is the green one, and then you can see a lot of growth in renewable diesel, and we'll talk about the policies that really drive that growth, that drove this growth in ethanol, and it's driving that growth in renewable diesel. And here in California, partly driven by a lot of those policies, we're seeing conversion of our refineries from being petroleum-based refineries to being renewable diesel refineries. And so there are two that have made that have basically asked for the permits to be able to make that change. The Marathon Petroleum refinery in Martinez has already made that conversion. So now they make renewable fuels rather than petroleum-based fuels. It doesn't take a lot to change the refinery over to those biomass resources to make renewable diesel instead. So I think they're just looking at the market changes in California. Okay, in the world, so it's only 3.5% of our transportation demand in the world. This is showing the share of transportation demand within different countries. So definitely Brazil, the leader there. And then you see US, Indonesia also have a fair amount of their transportation demand from biofuels. So let's talk about ethanol first, and then we'll get into biodiesel and renewable diesel probably on Wednesday. So ethanol is an alcohol. It's made by fermenting sugars. It is the alcohol in the beer and wine and liquor that we drink. So ethanol is well, it's not very toxic to us, right? It's not like methanol that makes us blind. It's ethanol is only slightly toxic to us. It is less energy dense than gasoline. So it takes about 1.5 gallons of ethanol to equal the energy content of a gallon of gasoline. And so you can think about that from a, carrying your fuel around standpoint. It's less energy dense. Commercially, it's made from sugars, corn in the US, sugarcane in Brazil. It can also be made cellulosic, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. We talked about how it's already used for other things. It's used as an oxygenate. It's used as an octane booster. It's very high octane. It's hard to move around. Ethanol is pretty corrosive. It hydrates. It attracts water. It can dry out seals and stuff. So we do have to have our systems be a little bit different to have ethanol in them. They can't just run in the gasoline pipelines or the same gasoline trucks. So we do have to transport ethanol differently. And then we have basically some waivers about its vapor pressure, because at certain blends of ethanol, you get a higher vapor pressure, which leads to more air pollution when you have ethanol in your mix. So the two biggest ways we make it are corn and sugarcane. In the US, I said it was corn. And that's just fermenting the sugars. So it's kind of the same way you would make a beer or wine. You're fermenting the sugars to make ethanol. We talked about this point earlier, but just to talk about it again, the land efficiency of making ethanol from corn and sugarcane is dramatically different. And so you can see the facts up there. You can get 1,400 gallons per acre per year, and sugarcane, 400 gallons per acre per year for corn. And so this comes up very much when we look at what's been deemed the carbon footprint of corn versus sugarcane. And so corn is thought of as having a fairly high carbon footprint, and sugarcane is much lower. It puts them in different categories in our policies, and where sugarcane is considered more of an advanced biofuel than corn. The challenge that's not directly in this kind of data is the land use change that you also have to think about. So one of the things we see with sugarcane, especially in Brazil, as demand for sugarcane grows, often sugarcane will take over the land that's been used for cattle, for example, which isn't a huge land use change. But then often the cattle will take over land that was rainforest. And that is a huge land use change. And so it depends on how you think about that land use change and thinking about that carbon footprint. So that's just one example. In the US, when we saw that growth in corn demand for meet our ethanol policies, we took over a lot of conservation land, actually, to grow new corn. And so again, you have that land use change from what was forested conservation land, often to help deal with flooding, became corn production. And so that land use change is part of the carbon footprint, or should be part of the carbon footprint when you're thinking about these fuels. All right, so that's how we make it. The holy grail, I would say, of ethanol production would be cellulosic. What does cellulosic mean? It means using the rest of the plant, right? We talked about this, the leaves and the things that are hard to break down. If we could use paper or anything like that to make ethanol, that would be better, because you could use things that weren't food crops. You could use switchgrass, was talked about a lot. It's something that could grow on hillsides and in marginal lands, and you can make ethanol from cellulosic sources. The challenge is that it's hard to break those down into an alcohol. And so we figured out ways to do that technologically. We even have had some, pilot scale facilities. Most of those have been shut down. It's just really challenging to do at scale and economically. And so we don't really have cellulosic development of ethanol today, other than at the research stage. Biggest producers of ethanol are the United States and Brazil, very much driven by policy. And you can see that US ethanol production growth in accordance to policy that was put in place. We'll talk about in a minute. For Brazil, ethanol was really their response to the Arab oil embargo. So it was an important event for policy in different countries all over the world, where it was like, oh my God, we're so dependent on oil, it's really impactful for our economy. And so Brazil really went to a policy that encouraged ethanol. Now, their dominant type of vehicle is what's called a flex fuel vehicle that can run either on gasoline or ethanol. And so it gives them this flexibility. It can run up to, some of them can even run up to E100, but it gives them this flexibility of running on gasoline or ethanol in their vehicles, depending on fuel prices and what's available at the pump. So very much dominated by a lot more ethanol use in Brazil. In the US, we make our ethanol where we grow our corn, so no surprise. So Iowa is our biggest ethanol producer. You tend not to want to move the corn very far, so you tend to produce the ethanol right near where you're growing the corn. So it's very much dominated in the Midwest. And I would say you hear it come up quite a bit in politics when issues around agriculture in the Midwest are on the docket, or they're talking about those things. So our policy really increased the acreage that we have for corn to meet the mandates for ethanol in our energy policies. So what I'm showing you here is US domestic corn use, what it's for. And you can see that growth we really more than doubled the amount of corn we were growing in order to meet our ethanol policies. And you can see that growth was really for making ethanol for transportation. So it's almost half of our corn crop goes to meet 10% of our transportation. All right, so food versus fuel. So one of the challenges, obviously, with using that corn for our transportation fuels, it's not available for food. And this impacts not just direct use of corn. We use corn in a lot of different products, but it also impacts meat because there are a lot of meat producers that also use corn as feed. And so the challenge really comes in when you have a drought year or something that disrupts your corn crop. We saw that quite a few years ago, and you can see some of the prices for corn. If we have a big spike, it can really impact not just domestic prices for food, but also other international places because we are a large exporter of corn. And so we really see these impacts of this corn versus fuel tension when we have those restrictions on the production. So I mentioned cellulosic as being the holy grail. This just kind of gives some of the reasons why cellulosic would be great if we could figure it out. Lower water use, not competing with food, able to do it on marginal land, able to use waste products, for example. But again, we just haven't figured it out technologically to do this commercially and at scale. Let's talk about two other major biofuels on the diesel side of things. You'll hear about biodiesel and renewable diesel, both biomass-based, but different fuels. So we talked about ethanol has that oxygen. Biodiesel also has an oxygen in it. It is not chemically the same as diesel, whereas renewable diesel is something we call a drop-in fuel, meaning it's chemically the same as diesel. What does that mean? Biodiesel can be blended up to about 20% into your diesel and run in a normal diesel engine. Renewable diesel, you can just replace it 100% because it's a drop-in fuel. We've tried to do drop-in fuels for gasoline. You can do it with algae, for example. We can have a drop-in fuel. We haven't been able to do that at scale. So we're stuck with things like ethanol as a biofuel on the gasoline side of things. We don't have at scale drop-in fuels. So those are the difference. Biodiesel has been used for a long time. Renewable diesel is really a growth area in the diesel section. In terms of where biodiesel production is taking place, same places it's kind of being used, US and Europe are the big ones. But I want to give you a sense of context. We're producing 2 billion gallons compared to our consumption of almost 50 billion gallons. It's a pretty small part of the market. Biodiesel is expected to decline as renewable diesel kind of takes over the market, but you can see predictions aren't a ton of growth in this area. So we've seen a lot of growth recently in renewable diesel, a lot of it driven by California's policies, but there's still not predictions that it's really going to take over the market. And just to give you a sense of scale again, this is diesel and this is the renewable diesel and biodiesel for the US. So it's a very small portion of the market. Our renewable diesels and our biodiesels are both made from vegetable oils, different ones in different parts of the world. So we tend to make them out of soybean here. Asia and South America primarily use palm oil. You can kind of see the breakdown of feedstocks in the US and what we're using. Of course, depending on your source, you're going to have different impacts. So I'm just highlighting one impact of biomass use. This is a palm oil plantation in Indonesia. This picture can show you kind of the difference between the palm oil plantation and what the natural rainforest looks like on that hillside. So very much going to a monolithic kind of culture from palm oil. Of course, palm oil is used for biodiesel and renewable diesel, but also used for food and a lot of different food resources. You can do it more sustainably than it's often done. So often they keep the understory of the palm trees kind of bare, but you can do enhanced understory, growth as an option. But both of these strategies really don't provide the natural habitat for the species that live there. And so this is just one example, but it's something we see over and over again in terms of our biomass use as an energy resource, is what was that land before? We talked about Brazil and the rainforest and using it for cattle or sugarcane. This is for palm oil, but we see that again and again. You can only use the land for one thing. There is competing uses for that land, whether it's for food, for natural places, or for energy. All right, I would be remiss not to at least mention sustainable aviation fuels, especially since there's so much interest in them right now. We talk about long-haul transportation being really hard to decarbonize. Aviation in particular, because you need something that's pretty energy dense if you're going to carry it around in an airplane. And liquid fuels tend to be very energy dense, so they're really hard to compete with for these other options, electrifying it, hydrogen, things like that. So there's a lot of interest. There's government programs going into sustainable aviation fuels. It is still a very, very, very small portion of the market right now. But we're seeing interest in making it, right now, a lot of it from used oils. But it looks like future production is going to be from things just like ethanol from corn and energy crops. So that's a space just to keep an eye on, and there's just a lot of interest and money going into this. Projections show that the cost of different types of sustainable aviation fuels will be different depending on the source. And there's also, when we're talking about used cooking oil, because that sounds like that's a waste stream, right? Why not use that as a biofuel? It's hard to collect. And I would say the other challenges is how much of our fuel needs can that actually replace. There are some estimates on the limitation of that as a biomass resource compared to some of these other sources. But we'll see right now it's the area of growth is in the used cooking oil and used animal fats. So there are two main policies on biofuels that I want to mention before we move on to our next section. Federally, at the US level, our big biofuel policy is the Renewable Fuel Standard. And the Renewable Fuel Standard was put in place to reduce the carbon intensity of our fuels. That is the goal of this policy, the stated goal anyway, and it is based on life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of the different fuels. And so you can see there are different categories. Renewable fuels, kind of like conventional biofuels, and then they have advanced biofuels and cellulosic biofuels and things like that. The challenge is figuring out what is the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. I told you I did some research in ethanol, and it felt like every year there was a new study on ethanol and what its life cycle greenhouse gas emissions were. Even recently, so these are two recent studies, one by the DOE, one by, funded by the DOE, one by the USDA, and you can see the difference. One found that corn ethanol is 24% higher greenhouse gas emissions than gasoline, the other one 39% lower. It's a challenge. It depends a lot on how you take into account that land use change, the fertilizers, the things that are going into your system. So it's hard to figure out, and you kind of have to figure it out for each way you're making that biofuel. The way that this fuel standard works is it actually set volumes of biofuel that had to be used in our fuel system. Now, the first challenge with that is that we weren't very good at predicting how much fuel demand we'd actually have. Fuel demand kind of plateaued. And so this became a really big portion of our fuel system, and so we couldn't meet some of the standards early on because of that. And the other challenge was that kind of blue wedge there. So I'm showing you both what the fuel standard said we had to do and what we actually did. That blue wedge was those advanced biofuels, including cellulosic. And I told you we didn't figure it out. We're not able to do it at scale. And so each year, the EPA who runs this program has had to put that target way lower than what the standard said, because we just physically can't make that level of cellulosic. So that's one challenge that we've seen with this policy. You can see the green is really the corn ethanol, the pink is really sugarcane ethanol, and then there's some biodiesel in the kind of the light blue wedge. The other challenge is how much can we mix into our fuel system? So in just a regular gasoline car, we can only run on E10, 10% ethanol. That's as much as we can put in there. There have been efforts to try to move it up to 15%, but the automakers are like, nope, it's not made for that. It's going to void your warranty. Don't put E15 in your car. Ethanol dries out seals. It can cause leakage. It's just not good for just a regular gasoline vehicle. You can make a vehicle that can run on higher blends than this, right? We saw that for Brazil. But it takes investment in a little bit different in the fuel system. Estimates I've seen is it's only about $150 per car to make those upgrades. It's not a huge cost investment, but you do have to have those upgrades in order to run on higher percentage ethanol. So we see this come up regularly. This is a little bit old data, partly because we don't really look at flex fuel vehicles in the US anymore. We've kind of moved on from this policy, and the policies don't benefit the automakers as much to make flex fuel vehicles. But they used to get a benefit on their fuel economy standard. And so they made flex fuel vehicles, but most of them didn't actually run on E85. And so we've kind of moved away from this policy. And so this is where you see this with policies. You try it, and it didn't work out. People weren't actually running it on ethanol, so they've phased out the benefit for automakers to make flex fuel vehicles. They've moved on to kind of the benefit being about electric vehicles instead. So the other policy I want to mention is California's policy. We have what's called the low carbon fuel standard. It is a cap and trade system in California for lowering the carbon intensity of our fuels. And you can see this is the compliance target and where we are, and it ratchets down each year in terms of meeting this carbon standard. If you look at what meets this standard, so it's based on a baseline of gasoline or diesel, depending on what you're replacing, and then what kind of fuel are you replacing it with. And so you can see things like corn ethanol doesn't meet the standard if you take into account indirect land use change, which they do. But sugarcane ethanol would. And so that's where we were importing sugarcane ethanol. But as it ratchets down, these ones are no longer going to meet the standard, and we're going to have to move to other fuels. This is what it looks like right now in terms of what we're meeting in California, and you can go look it up. They have a very nice dashboard, so you can look these things up. You can see ethanol, a lot of growth in renewable diesel as part of the ways of meeting our low carbon fuel standard, and importing a lot of renewable diesel. So I mentioned for a while to meet this standard, we were both exporting and importing ethanol in order to get sugarcane ethanol to meet California standard, and then export corn ethanol to Brazil. We're still a net exporter, but much less. Like I said, there's a new tariff in Brazil where we're no longer exporting as much to Brazil and no longer importing as much sugarcane ethanol as well. And then biodiesel. These are kind of the mix of fuels that we're using for biodiesel or renewable diesel. A lot of them are waste streams right now. So California is really focused on those waste streams for the renewable diesel. And even our refineries are changing. We talked about our refineries changing to make renewable diesels for the California market. So this is just driving home that point that, yes, renewable diesel where it's used is in California. You can see the places domestically where we're producing it. And this is what the overall import-export looks like. in terms of we're a net exporter of ethanol. We don't import as much ethanol as we used to. We do import things like biodiesel, both import and export them. So just to summarize what we've talked about in terms of biofuels, this is just kind of a summary of some of the additional concerns that we see. One of them we didn't talk about too much was often when you change to your land use change to a crop like corn, what we saw is a lot more fertilizers getting into our waterways. So that was two reasons. One was the expansion of the corn crop itself, and two, a lot of it went into conservation land that used to be the buffer between agricultural land and rivers. So with that fertilizer loading of things like the Mississippi River, we see things like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and this has definitely been linked to our energy policy for biofuels on ethanol. We also saw things like this in the Chesapeake Bay linked to corn production. And then, of course, water intensity. We didn't talk a lot about this, but they tend to be pretty water intensive when you think about corn as a crop for biofuels. Thank you guys for your attention.